1st of December. I'm Stephen Ridgway on the Countdown to Christmas. Hi. Chrome has a 0-day vulnerability. Okay, it has a vulnerability being exploited as a 0-day, blah, 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 whatever. The terminology of this stuff is getting increasingly pointless, isn't it? Basically, there is a patch, an update for Chrome, which is addressing a newly discovered high severity bug within Chrome. The vulnerability is being tracked as CVE 2023 7024 and is what they're calling a heap-based buffer overflow bug in WebRTC, in the WebRTC framework. Could be exploited to result in program crashes or also arbitrary code execution. The update, just checking for the versions. So the version to aim for is 120.0.6099.129/130, so 129 or 130 for Windows, and 120.0.6099.129 for Mac and Linux. Also, be aware, as always, other Chromium-based browsers, notable ones being Edge, Brave, Opera, and Vivaldi. Check that the updates are available and have been applied for your browsers as well. Want to keep it up, keep an eye on. Even if Chrome is not saying restart to update, give it a nudge, because this one is being actively exploited in the wild. There is a campaign which is being carried out by pro-Palestinian hacktivist groups, in particular a group known as Pandala, that is sending out fake F5 Big IP phishing emails. So basically, a phishing email purporting to come from F5, warning users of a vulnerability that requires an update. So if you follow the links and download the updates, you don't end up with a patch, you end up with some malware. Okay, in particular sort of malwares, they're wipers. They're just designed to cause disruption and chaos. At the moment, this stuff is being focused on Israeli companies, unsurprisingly given the conflict at the moment. However, it is worth being aware of these things because other countries in the West are seen to be supporting the Israeli position for however you look at it. That's just the way it is. So that does mean I suspect that organisations in UK, Europe, and so on may potentially be seen as legitimate targets for this. There are a couple of indicators of compromise. There's a couple of indicators of compromise. You can tell it's nearly Christmas, can't you? In the article in Bleeping Computer that we'll link to this briefing, but the Windows users get effectively, by following the links, you end up with an executable named f5updata.exe, and for Linux it is just update.sh. both of which are known by VirusTotal. So there is a high probability that if you're running decent endpoint protection, this stuff will get caught. However, it is worth being aware of it anyway. So as always, be aware of phishing campaigns. This stuff is not aiming to extort; it is just aiming to cause chaos by deploying a wiper. Okay. And then finally from me today, I came across an interesting article in SC Magazine, which looks at the exploitation, statistics around the exploitation of vulnerabilities. So the article is summarising work that has been done by Qualys. So we can be confident that the information behind this is going to be quite solid, good information. It's not based on a handful of personal views on this stuff. I think some takeaways from this, some very interesting points and things to think about. 1 in 4 high-risk CVEs are exploited within 24 hours of them going public. So I know we talk in these briefings a lot about patching, and I do try not to turn this into the What to Patch Today show, but actually often patching is the most effective way of rapidly dealing with rapidly mitigating the risks of these vulnerabilities being exploited. However, the window of opportunity for patching is it's much smaller than it was previously. There used to be a while between the vulnerability being discovered and announced and exploit code being generally available. And all you've got to bear in mind is if somebody's found the vulnerability, some of the stuff gets found by, researchers and people what would be known as white hat people back in the day. I haven't heard that phrase in a while, but you know what I mean. But a lot of this stuff is actually discovered by malicious groups anyway. I mean, bearing in mind that APTs, and yes, they are a real threat. They're not some imaginary stuff that working off in James Bond land. But there are some very well funded and very well trained and educated groups that are highly motivated to find vulnerabilities and build exploits. So a lot of this stuff actually is known about before it ever gets it's known about within certain circles before it ever goes public. Therefore, as soon as something is public, the likelihood is that there are already floating around somewhere the potential exploit code, whatever it may be. So keeping on top of patching is, I think, very important. I know there are arguments for and against because patching can be seen as onerous and dangerous, and depending on your the risk appetite of your business, the amount of regression testing that you need to do when you patch things can be onerous. However, I think that argument for most organisations is probably less valid than it used to be, given the rapid exploitation of most vulnerabilities. And if we're down to within 24 hours, the likelihood that you can go through extensive testing before rolling out a patch it is, it's fairly unlikely, to be honest. I think perhaps the way to look at this would be, along the lines of, well, if you patch regularly and something goes wrong, the likelihood is that you're going to know what you've patched and be able to address that. Basically, roll back to the pre-patched state, have a look at what went wrong, and try again. Now, but most, not all, but most patches these days don't actually break things. 20 odd years ago, when I was much closer to actually doing rather than doing this stuff rather than looking at and thinking about other people doing these things. But when I was doing these things, there was a time 20 odd years ago when you would install patches and you really would cross your fingers as to what would break. And that did lead to an approach of, well, in zero downtime or zero downtime organizations or organizations that had very high uptime SLAs, patching things was seen to be a very high risk activity. I think two things have happened. One is the number of vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited, and the amount of exploit code that's out there has increased enormously over the last 20 odd years. The rate at which vulnerabilities are exploited, as we can see from this article, is it's not days anymore, let alone weeks. It was a while back. And equally, the risk now of something breaking is less, I think, than the risk that if you leave it unpatched, it will get exploited. The caveat to that would be, of course, there are certain sorts of apps and certain sorts of environments where you don't want things to break. Let's say, for example, the IT systems supporting operations in medical centres, for example. You don't really want that stuff being rapidly patched, breaking, and then rolling back. You need to know that it's going to work. In which case, then, the best approach is to be very conservative around the mitigating controls that you put in place to protect those systems. So be very careful about who can access them. Make sure that network microsegmentation remains one of the best ways of addressing this stuff. Zero trust is good, difficult to deploy successfully, in my opinion. But definitely the right direction of travel. But good old-fashioned network microsegmentation, which fell out of fashion 10 years ago, I think, it needs to be seen as something that should come back in again. If you have got systems you can't patch, put protections around them, make them real protections, not theoretical, according to my architectural diagram protections. Actually go and test this stuff. And be very cautious about who can go near these things. Some other interesting stats from this particular article: less than 1% of vulnerabilities contributed to the highest risk and were routinely exploited in the wild. So actually keeping on top of what's going on and keeping on top of patching, again, it isn't an insurmountable task to keep on top of this stuff. You're looking for is the high risk stuff, and if you've got good vulnerability management processes in your organization, you should be able to identify what are the most likely, what are the highest risk vulnerabilities within the organization, which potential business critical systems have got which vulnerabilities and how likely are those to be exploited, given all the so keeping on top of that properly is really important. Third of high risk vulnerabilities were aimed at network devices and web applications, and the top three MITRE attack tactics were exploitation of remote services and public-facing applications, and the exploitation for privilege escalation. So very interesting article, definitely worth reading, definitely worth thinking about. Raises some very solid points. Use the MITRE attack framework in order to understand what it is that you're trying to protect against, and be sure that you understand that intersection between cyber risk and business risk, so that when you are putting in place mitigating controls, be them patches or anything else, you understand that those are addressed to the right things within your organisation. Anyway, that is quite enough from me for one morning. Hope you have a really good Thursday, and I will speak to you again tomorrow morning.